Picture this, a grand estate in the county of Devonshire, its stone walls pale gold in the morning light, its grounds immaculate, its reputation beyond reproach. 400 guests assembled in the ballroom, earls and viscounts, and their carefully dressed wives, all of them watching the Duke of Ashenvale with the particular attention reserved for men who hold the kind of power that shapes other people's futures, without their knowledge or consent. And at his side, not his wife. His wife, Lady Cecilia Ashenvale, stood perhaps 12 feet away, near the window, holding a glass of champagne she had not touched. She had been his wife for 9 years. She had managed his correspondence, received his guests, organized his charitable contributions, and maintained the fiction of a contented household with the disciplined composure of a woman who had learned very early that composure was the only currency she had reliable access to. Tonight, the Duke raised his glass and smiled at the woman beside him, a woman in a gown of deep amber who was not his wife, and said, in that carrying, pleasant voice that had always made every room feel like it was built specifically for him, "I should like you all to know Miss Harriet Blaine, who has become indispensable to me in every sense that word allows." 400 people understood precisely what that meant. They turned to look at Cecilia. She set her glass down on the tray of a passing footman. She smoothed the front of her ivory gown with one hand. She walked toward the pair of them, not quickly, not with any outward indication of the thing happening inside her chest, which was less like heartbreak, and more like the specific, cold recognition of something she had already known, but had chosen not to examine too closely. She stopped in front of Miss Blaine. She looked at her for one unhurried moment, then she inclined her head, precisely and gracefully, and said, "How delightful!" She turned. She did not look at her husband. She walked to the door, not quickly, not with tears, not with a single word of drama or recrimination. She simply left, and the 400 guests in that ballroom would speak of that moment for a very long time. But here is what none of them knew. Here is what Cecilia Ashenvale had not told anyone. Not her sister, not the housekeeper who had served her faithfully for 9 years, not even the solicitor whose letter had arrived 2 weeks prior and was currently sitting in the locked drawer of her dressing table. She had been planning this for longer than anyone would have guessed. Cecilia had come to marriage at 21 with a genuinely open heart and a reasonably clear understanding of what she was entering. The match had been arranged. These things were, at her level of society, but she had not disliked Hugh Ashenvale when she met him. He was intelligent, composed, and possessed of a dry wit that surfaced occasionally and unexpectedly, like a fish in a still pond. Her parents had been satisfied. Hugh's family had required an heir and a capable hostess, and Cecilia, who had been raised precisely to be both, had stepped into the role without complaint. 9 years later, she understood something she had not understood at 21. There is a difference between a man who does not love you and a man who does not see you. Hugh had never been cruel. She had told herself this so many times it had worn a groove. He was not cruel. He was simply, and this was the word she had arrived at eventually, through the careful examination of 9 years of evidence, absent, present in body at the breakfast table, at the dinners, at the county occasions that required his attendance, absent in everything that required him to notice that the woman across the table was a person with a particular way of thinking, particular opinions, particular things she found funny and things she did not. He had looked through her for 9 years, pleasantly, without malice, which was, she had concluded, almost worse. She had suspected Miss Blaine for 4 months. Not suspected precisely. She was not a suspicious woman by nature, but she had noticed a certain quality of distraction in Hugh when he returned from London, a name mentioned once too often, and then not mentioned at all, which was its own form of information. She had not confronted him. She had done something else instead. She had written to her father's old solicitor. Mr. Fenwick Grail was 73 years old, partially deaf in one ear, and possessed of a legal mind so precise that Cecilia had once seen him spot an inconsistency in a property deed that 3 other solicitors had reviewed and cleared. He had been her father's man for 40 years. He had attended her parents' wedding. He had sat in the front row at hers and had shaken Hugh's hand with an expression that she now, in retrospect, recognized as carefully neutral. She had asked him a single question. What, precisely and legally, is mine? Mr. Grail had replied with characteristic thoroughness and no unnecessary words. The Marrow Family Trust, established by her maternal grandfather and maintained in her name alone, had been generating income for 11 years, income she had never drawn, had indeed forgotten existed, had assumed with the unthinking ease of a woman absorbed in another life, had simply dissolved into the general finances of marriage. It had not dissolved, it had accumulated. Mr. Grail had written the figure in his small, even hand, and she had read it twice and set the letter down and looked out at the grounds for a long time. She was not wealthy by the standards of the Ashenvale estate. She was independent. The distinction was important. The house called Marrow Park, her mother's family home, left to her in a bequest worded with such specificity that Hugh's solicitors had confirmed on inquiry that it was unambiguously hers outside the Ashenvale estate, beyond Hugh's reach or claim, had been shuttered for 6 years. She had a housekeeper there, a sensible woman named Mrs. Croft, who had managed the property in her absence without complaint, and, according to her most recent letter, without any visible deterioration. Cecilia arrived on a Friday morning, 3 days after the Ashenvale autumn gathering, with 2 trunks, her personal maid Kitty, and a leather case containing every document Mr. Grail had forwarded in the preceding 48 hours. There had been considerably more than she anticipated. Mrs. Croft opened the door before the carriage had fully stopped, looked at Cecilia, looked at the trunks, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "The east rooms are already aired, my lady. There's a good fire on, and I've made soup." "Thank you, Mrs. Croft," Cecilia said. "That will do very nicely." The house smelled of beeswax and old stone and something underneath both of those that she identified after a moment as the particular quality of a place that belongs to you in the way that only inherited things do. Not earned, not acquired, simply yours, woven into the record of who you are before you were anyone's wife. She went directly to the study, opened the leather case, and got to work. The first visitor arrived on the 3rd day. Lady Nora Strathwell came in a carriage with a slightly broken spring. She mentioned this twice, cheerfully, as though it were an adventure rather than an inconvenience, and arrived on Cecilia's doorstep with a jar of preserved plums and the expression of a woman who has something to say and intends to say it. She was Cecilia's oldest friend. They had been at school together, had navigated their first season in tandem, had corresponded faithfully through a decade of marriage and the particular distance it creates. She walked into the study, looked at Cecilia at the desk, surrounded by papers, and said, "You look remarkably well for a woman who's just been publicly humiliated." "Sit down, Nora," Cecilia said. "Everyone is talking," Nora said, sitting. "In case you were concerned about the volume, what are they saying? That Hugh has lost his mind, that Miss Blaine has miscalculated badly, that your—" she paused, selecting the word— "composure was the most devastating thing witnessed in a Devonshire ballroom in living memory." She accepted tea from Mrs. Croft and looked at Cecilia steadily. "They can't decide whether you're very brave or completely broken." "How do I appear?" Cecilia asked. Nora studied her, the papers, the absence of swollen eyes or crumpled handkerchiefs, or the particular hollowness that grief carves into a face. "Occupied," she said finally. "I am," Cecilia said. She did not elaborate. Nora, who was wise enough to know when elaboration was not yet available, did not press. She came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. And she was not the only one. They came, the women of the county, with varying degrees of pretended casualness. Lady Strathwell came first, of course. Then Mrs. Brentwood, who claimed she was passing, and stayed for 2 hours. Then young Mrs. Caulfield, recently married and already quietly unhappy, who arrived with no pretense at all and simply said, "I didn't know where else to go." Cecilia brought her in, gave her tea, listened without offering advice unless it was requested. When Mrs. Caulfield left, she looked somehow steadier than when she had arrived. They all came, these women. Some from genuine affection, some from curiosity, some from an instinct they could not quite name. That something was happening at Merrow Park worth being near. Cecilia received them all and did not stop working. The papers on the desk multiplied. Mr. Grayle visited in person on the 8th day, his old briefcase full of documents he spread across the dining table, while Mrs. Croft brought shortbread and made no pretense of not listening. He explained to Cecilia, in his careful and methodical way, the precise architecture of the Ashenvale finances. It was, he said, with the understatement of a man who had delivered unwelcome news for half a century, not a straightforward picture. "How complicated?" Cecilia asked. Mr. Grayle looked at her over his reading spectacles. He had known her since she was 4 years old. He had never delivered difficult information to anyone quite as composed as she was at this moment. "The Duke," he said, "has been making significant withdrawals against the estate for approximately 5 years. The nature of those withdrawals is irregular." "Irregular," Cecilia repeated. Miss Blaine's circumstances prior to her association with the Duke were also irregular. A pause. There was a previous connection with a baronet in Somerset. He is no longer in possession of his family estate. Cecilia looked out the study window at the garden, where someone had recently begun the work of clearing overgrown rose beds. "I see," she said. She picked up her pen. "Mr. Grayle, I should like to understand everything. Not the simplified account, everything." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his briefcase and produced another folder considerably thicker than the first, and placed it on the table between them. "I was rather hoping you would say that," he said. The picture that assembled itself, document by document, across her dining table over the following 2 weeks was considerably more detailed than even Mr. Grayle had initially indicated. Hugh Ashenvale was not a dishonest man. Cecilia held on to this the way she had once held on to "he is not cruel," as a statement of fact rather than a defense. He was not dishonest. He was, and this was the precise word she arrived at after examining the evidence from every available angle, credulous. He had invested 5 years ago in a series of ventures with the confident enthusiasm of a man who had never had serious reason to doubt his own judgment. A shipping concern, a land scheme in the north of England, something described, with notable vagueness, in the relevant documents as a continental trading partnership. All of it had failed. Rather than absorb the losses and proceed with reduced expenditure, which would have been unglamorous but entirely survivable, he had borrowed to cover the debt, and then borrowed again to cover the interest, and had eventually, and this was the part that produced in Cecilia a cold and particular dread, approached lenders that a man of his position should not have approached at all. Miss Harriet Blaine had entered his life approximately 3 years ago. Mr. Grayle had been thorough about Miss Blaine. Her name had not always been Blaine. She had been born Harriet Pike in Bristol, had reinvented herself twice in the intervening years, and had moved through 2 separate social circles, each a step above the last, leaving behind her men who had found their financial situations mysteriously contracted and their standing mysteriously compromised. The baronet in Somerset, Sir George Caldmore, had been the most complete example, capable, well regarded, not a man easily deceived, and yet he had ended the association without his estate, without his income, and without a clear understanding of the precise sequence of events that had produced this outcome. Cecilia read the file on Harriet Pike twice. Then she folded it, placed it in the leather case, and sat for a while in the quiet sitting room, while the fire went on about its business and the evening came down over the gardens. She did not feel vindicated. She had expected something sharper, triumph, perhaps, or the clean edge of righteous anger. What she felt was something closer to the grief you feel for waste. For the 9 years, for the man Hugh might have been with better judgment and more honesty, for the life they might have had if either of them had been brave enough to say, earlier, what was actually true. She gave herself 20 minutes of this. Then she opened the case and went back to work. It was on a Wednesday afternoon, 11 days after Cecilia had arrived at Merrill Park, that she first encountered Mr. Aldrich Vane. She had known of him vaguely, a name mentioned in county contexts, something to do with land improvement and forestry, quietly well regarded by people whose regard meant something. She had met him perhaps once at a large gathering where he had made no particular impression, which she now understood said more about the gathering than about him. He appeared at the edge of the garden at 3:30, hat in hand, with the expression of a man who has a reasonable purpose and is uncertain how it will be received. "Lady Ashenvale," he said, "forgive the intrusion. My property shares your eastern boundary. I've been meaning to call properly, but I didn't want to." He paused. "Overwhelmed seems like the wrong word. Presumé," Cecilia suggested. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the preliminary condition of one. "Yes, that. You are not presuming, Mr. Vane. Would you like to see the rose garden? I've been trying to determine which beds are worth restoring, and I find myself unqualified to judge." He was, as it turned out, considerably qualified to judge. He knew about gardens the way Cecilia was coming to understand was characteristic of him, thoroughly, without performance, all the way down to the soil composition and the drainage and the particular requirements of old roses that had been left too long without attention. He told her which beds were salvageable, which required full replanting, which were simply beyond what any reasonable investment of effort could redeem. He did not tell her what to decide. He laid out the options and their consequences, and then stopped and let her think. She found this extraordinarily restoring. When he left, Cecilia watched him walk back along the eastern boundary and thought that she could not remember the last time a conversation had left her feeling more rather than less like herself. She went inside. On the desk, Mr. Grayle's papers waited. From Ashenvale Hall, 16 miles away, a carriage was already being ordered. Hugh arrived on a Thursday afternoon without sending word ahead. Cecilia recognized this as intentional. He had expected to find her unprepared, in a darkened room somewhere, waiting to be retrieved. Instead, he found her in the rose garden, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, consulting with the gardener about the drainage on the west side, her hair pinned back with the practical efficiency of a woman who had not spent a single moment of the past 2 weeks thinking about her appearance. She saw his carriage come up the lane. She finished her conversation. She pulled down her sleeves, buttoned her cuffs, and walked to meet him. "Hugh," she said. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has rearranged itself without his permission. "Cecilia, you look." He stopped. "Well," she said pleasantly, "come inside. Mrs. Croft will bring tea." He sat in the small sitting room and looked around it with the expression of a man encountering dimensions he had not accounted for. Ashenvale Hall had 38 rooms. This house had 8. He looked displaced in it like a piece of furniture that belongs somewhere else. "This is unnecessary," he said, the opener of a man who had rehearsed several versions of this conversation and chosen authority as his primary register. "Merrill Park belonged to my mother," Cecilia said, "and now it belongs to me. I am home, Hugh. I think what you mean is that you'd like me to come back to Ashenvale. Those are different things." He set down his teacup. There were shadows under his eyes she had not seen before. Something slightly unsteady in the set of his jaw, the look of a man who had been sleeping badly and had more reason to than he yet fully understood. "People are talking," he said. "People are always talking," Cecilia said. "They're talking about you, I think, rather more than about me. I've been told I've been cast in a sympathetic light." His jaw tightened. "You made a scene." Cecilia looked at him steadily. "I inclined my head and said good evening. I should very much like to know which part of that constitutes a scene." He had no answer for this. She had known he wouldn't. He left 40 minutes later without having retrieved anything he had come for. Cecilia watched his carriage go from the sitting-room window. Then she turned back to her desk. She had not told him what she knew. Not yet. There was a sequence to these things, and she understood the sequence, and she was not ready to move to the next part. She had been waiting. The unraveling began in November. As these things do, the county had a way of finding the edges of a secret and pulling, not from malice precisely, or not only from malice, but because secrets are structurally unstable in communities built on reputation and mutual surveillance. They need to move. They need to be known. The first visible crack appeared at Mrs. Thornham's card evening, where Harriet Blaine arrived wearing a gown of considerable expense and took a seat at the table with the confidence of a woman who believed her position was more established than it was. Lady Strathwell, who was 69 years old and had outlasted 4 county scandals and 1 genuine catastrophe, looked at her across the table and said, with the pleasantness of a woman asking about the weather, "Miss Blaine, I wonder if you might settle something for me. Wasn't there some years ago a connection, in Somerset, I believe, involving Sir George Caldmore?" The table went quiet. Harriet smiled. "I'm afraid I don't recall a Sir George Caldmore." "How peculiar," Lady Strathwell said, arranging her cards with great composure. "He recalls you with great clarity." It was a small thing, a question, a deflection, a pause, nothing provable. But the county was a machine that ran on precisely this kind of fuel, and by the following morning the question had spread and attached itself to other questions that had been quietly accumulating. Who was she precisely? Where did she come from? And what had actually happened to Sir George Caldmore? Hugh heard the whispers. He heard them the way you hear thunder, first distant enough to ignore, then impossible to pretend away. He went to Harriet with what he had heard, and she was reassuring and plausible and warm, and he believed her for approximately 4 days. Then a letter arrived from his primary creditor, and the letter was not long, and it did not need to be, and Hugh poured himself a drink, and then another, and then went to Harriet and told her about the letter because he realized, no one else to tell. She listened. She was sympathetic. She held his hand and looked at him with those clear eyes and said, "Hugh, darling, I've been thinking. Lord Hartmore has expressed an interest in investment opportunities, and he's enormously wealthy, and if you were to facilitate an introduction—" Hugh looked at her. Something shifted, a flicker at the corner of a truth he had been refusing to look at directly. "You want me to introduce you," he said slowly, "to a wealthy lord?" Harriet smiled. "I want us to solve our problems together, my love." He thought. He thought about Sir George Caldmore. He thought about Cecilia standing in his ballroom with 400 pairs of eyes on her face, setting down her glass, inclining her head at the woman beside him, and walking out without a single backward glance. He thought about Cecilia in her garden with her sleeves rolled up, looking at him as though he were something she had already accounted for and moved quietly past. He had another drink. Several, in fact, and the next morning he wrote to Merrow Park. The note said, simply, "Cecilia, I believe we should speak properly." Cecilia read it at her desk. She set it down. She looked at it for a moment. Then she wrote back in her clear, even hand, "Come Thursday then. Send word ahead. Mrs. Croft will make lunch." He arrived on a Thursday looking older than he had any right to look in 3 weeks' time. Not the gradual aging of years, but the sudden kind, the kind that consequences produce. Something had gone out of him. That easy confidence, the quality of a man who had never seriously had to reckon with his own mistakes. Still present, but diminished. Like a lamp turned down, she noticed. She did not remark on it. "Come in," she said. "The soup is nearly ready." Mrs. Croft had made a simple meal. Good soup, good bread, a cold joint, a tart from the last of the autumn apples that Mr. Vane had advised her to press before the first frost. Hugh sat at the small dining table and looked around the house with the expression of a man trying to understand a thing that resisted his understanding. "You're settled here," he said. "Not a question." "Very," Cecilia said. "I didn't think you would be." She looked at him. "I know you didn't." They ate in silence for a moment. The fire was warm. Outside, a thrush was conducting urgent business near the garden wall. The house had the quality that Ashenvale Hall, with its 38 rooms and its history of performing grandeur, had never quite managed. It was genuinely comfortable. Not impressive, simply itself. "I've made mistakes," Hugh said finally. He did not say Harriet's name. "With the estate, with certain decisions." He stopped and started again. "Things are more complicated than they should be." "Yes," Cecilia said. "I know." He looked up sharply. "What do you know?" "Enough," she said. "Mr. Grail is thorough." Something moved across his face. Shame and something like anger arriving together and contesting for precedence. Shame won, narrowly. "You've been investigating me. I've been understanding my own situation," Cecilia said with perfect evenness. "Which required understanding yours. I should have done it years ago. That is on me as much as anyone." He was quiet for a long time. The thrush moved on. "I want you to come back," he said. There it was. Cecilia had known it was coming, had known it since the note arrived, had known it before that, had understood when she walked out of his ballroom and heard the door of the house close quietly behind her, that Hugh Ashenvale had never genuinely accounted for the possibility of her absence. She had been there for 9 years. She had been as present and as reliable as the hall itself, as the grounds, as the stable clock that had not missed a quarter hour in 40 years. He had simply assumed she would continue to be there, the way men assume certain things will continue, without gratitude, without attention, without the conscious knowledge that they are assuming anything at all. She was not angry about this anymore. She had been briefly, intensely, at 2 o'clock in the morning on several nights in this house, but anger, she had found, was costly. It required maintenance. It produced very little of practical value. She had spent it and moved past it. "Why?" she asked. He blinked. "What? Why do you want me to come back? I'd like to understand what you mean by it." Hugh opened his mouth, closed it. He had prepared, she could tell, for refusal, for tears, for bargaining, for some version of the scene he had denied she had made. He had not prepared for a woman who simply wanted to understand his reasoning. "Because you're my wife," he said finally. "I am," Cecilia agreed. "I have been for 9 years, while you were otherwise occupied. The fact of the thing isn't sufficient on its own, Hugh. What would be different? I'd like a real answer." Silence. "I don't know," he said at last. And in 9 years of marriage, that was the most unguarded thing she had ever heard him say. She felt it the way you feel something that is true even when it is not enough. Almost. "That is the most honest answer you've ever given me," she said quietly. "I am glad of it. But it is not, I think, sufficient. The offer, when it came, was practical. This was at least consistent. Hugh had never been a romantic man, or rather, he had deployed the appearance of romance as a social instrument in the way he deployed everything. What he offered now was stripped of performance, because he had run out of resources for it. She would return to Ashenvale Hall, resume her position. The county would accept it. They would accept anything Cecilia put her name to, and this had become clear to both of them in recent weeks. The creditors could be managed if the estate presented a stable face. The situation with Harriet was resolving itself. In return, he searched for the word, present. He would make an effort to be present. Cecilia listened to all of it. She listened properly, the way she had learned to do in the past weeks, fully, without preparing her response while he was speaking. Then she was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, not harshly, not with triumph, simply no. Hugh stared at her. "I'm not returning to Ashenvale Hall," Cecilia said, "not on those terms. Not on any terms that resemble the past 9 years. I am not doing this to punish you. Punishment is exhausting, and I have a great many better uses for my time. But returning to what we had would require me to pretend that what we had was sufficient, and I find I cannot do that anymore. I have used up my capacity for pretending. Then what?" His voice had an edge. Not anger exactly, but the raw sound of a man who has no more moves. "I don't want anything from you," she said. The simplicity of it seemed to land on him like something physical. "That is rather the point. I have what I need. I have this house, and the trust, and Mr. Grail, and my own mind, which is, it turns out, quite a useful one when given room to operate." She looked at him steadily. "I need you to understand that." He sat across from her and looked, for the first time she could remember, genuinely at a loss. She felt for him then. Not love, not the love she had arrived at marriage with, which had been real enough and deserved better than it received, but something simpler and harder to ignore than love. He was a man who had built himself entirely on surfaces, and the surfaces had failed him, and underneath was someone who had never learned what to do without them. "What becomes of us?" he asked. "I don't know yet," Cecilia said honestly. "But whatever it is, it will be the truth. That is more than we've managed in quite some time." He was waiting in the lane for his carriage when Mr. Aldrich Vane came along the eastern boundary path. It appeared accidental. It was possibly accidental. Vane had the quality Cecilia had come to notice in him, of simply being where he was, without announcement or apology, requiring no explanation for his existence in any given place. The two men looked at each other across the lane. They had met before at county occasions, not friends, not enemies, men who knew each other's general measure and had formed no particular opinion. "Ashenvale," Vane said. His voice was neutral, not cold, not warm. "Vane." Hugh looked at him for a moment. "You're the neighbor, then?" "The eastern boundary," Vane said. "Your wife's rose garden is in better shape than it was a fortnight ago. Good soil there." Hugh looked at him for a long, considering moment. Then he looked back at the house, where Cecilia had returned to the window, not watching exactly, but present in the way she was always present now, aware of everything, missing nothing. Hugh Ashenvale, who had been educated at the finest schools, who possessed a title that was 4 centuries old, who had charm and ease and every social advantage the world of 1887 could offer a man, felt, for the first time in his adult life, the specific cold weight of understanding what he had lost. Not the wife in the abstract sense of the word, the woman, the precise, irreplaceable particular woman who had been standing 3 feet away from him in his own ballroom, and whom he had looked straight through. His carriage came round the turn. He got in without another word. Vane watched it go. Then he walked to the front door and knocked. Cecilia opened it. "I saw," she said. "Come in, there's apple tart." He came in. They sat in the sitting room with the fire going and the tart between them and the particular silence that had developed over the past 2 weeks. Not the silence of things unsaid, but of things that simply did not require saying. It was the rarest kind of quiet. She had not known, before this month, that it existed. "He'll contest this," Vane said eventually. Not a prediction. An observation offered without alarm. "I know," Cecilia said. "Are you all right?" She considered the question properly, the way she had learned to consider everything. Not the reflexive fine, thank you that 9 years of performed composure had made automatic, but the real answer, located by actually looking. Yes, she said, rather. He looked at her in the firelight with the half-finished tart between them and Mr. Grail's papers on the desk. He looked at her in a way no one had looked at her in a very long time, not at the Duchess, not at the reputation, not at the story the county was constructing around her. At Cecilia. I should tell you something, he said. She waited. I was at the Bramley gathering 3 years ago, when you were there with Hugh. He was quiet for a moment. I thought you were the most interesting person in the room. I thought so every time I encountered you that season, and then I thought it and said nothing and did nothing, because you were another man's wife, and that was the end of it. Cecilia looked at the fire for a long moment. Why are you telling me this now? Because I have been your neighbor for 2 weeks and your friend for 1, he said. And I find I am running out of patience with not being honest. He met her eyes. I'm not telling you to do anything with it. I simply wanted you to know that someone noticed you before all of this. Someone was paying attention. The fire crackled. Outside, the last of the evening light was pulling back from the garden in long, pale streaks. Cecilia felt something move. Not the thunderclap of romantic fiction, nothing so legible as that. Something quieter and more durable, something that had been very still for a long time, waiting without knowing it was waiting. Mr. Vane, she said. Yes. Ask me to dinner next week, properly. He looked at her. The preliminary condition of a smile arrived at last into the full, real thing. It suited him enormously. She had suspected it would. Lady Ashenvale, he said, would you do me the honor of dining with me next Thursday? I would, she said. Thank you for asking. It matters how a thing is asked. Harriet Pike, because she was Harriet Pike, under the Blaine, and under the 3 previous names she had acquired and discarded with the same practical efficiency with which she managed everything, made her final miscalculation in late November. Harriet operated on instinct, sharp, precise, preemptive instinct that had served her exceptionally well for 15 years. The difficulty with instinct, as opposed to considered judgment, is that it does not slow when slowing is what the situation requires. It simply continues at speed in the direction it has always gone. She had set her attention on Lord Hartmore, 61 years old, recently bereaved, in possession of a fortune so substantial that careful people grew slightly faint when they thought about it too closely. She had identified him at Lady Witchford's musical in November, positioned herself in his orbit with the ease of long practice, and within an hour had produced in him the particular warm distraction that had always been her most reliable instrument. What she did not know, could not have known, because she had not been attending to the currents of county intelligence with her usual care, too occupied with the deteriorating situation at Ashenvale Hall, was that Lord Hartmore was Lady Strathwell's nephew. And Lady Strathwell had been paying attention for 6 weeks. Nora Strathwell was 69 years old, and had seen everything the county had to offer in the way of human weakness and social maneuvering, and she had in the course of those years developed a fine and calibrated understanding of certain particular patterns. She recognized Harriet Pike the way a gardener recognizes a particular invasive species, not with alarm, but with the calm, practical intention to remove it before it spreads. She had written to friends in Somerset. She had made inquiries through her husband's legal connections. She had had a long and informative conversation with Mr. Grail, not about Cecilia's affairs, which were not her concern, but about certain other matters which very much were. She was ready when it became necessary to be ready. She told her nephew on a Friday morning. She laid out what she knew in order, without embellishment or sensationalism, with the documentary evidence placed on the breakfast table between them. Lord Hartmore, who was 61 but not credulous, read every page. He did not send word to Harriet Blaine. He did not explain or apologize for his withdrawal. He simply disappeared from her horizon, as men who are warned in time always do. Harriet noticed his absence. She made inquiries. She received no satisfying answer. For the first time in 15 years, she felt the ground shift. It happened at the county assembly in December. Not dramatically. The county never did things dramatically when it could accomplish the same effect through a lowered temperature. The slight coolness of a greeting. The microscopic hesitation before a smile. The way a conversation seemed to conclude naturally at the precise moment she approached. It was the art of a society that had been managing its own membership for generations, and it left no visible marks, and it was absolute. She moved through the room and felt it, degree by degree. Lady Strathwell was there. Harriet had known she would be. She had told herself it would be manageable. But Lady Strathwell was speaking to Lord Fenwick, and as Harriet passed, she heard clearly, in that carrying, unhurried voice, the words Somerset and Caldmore and extraordinary coincidence, wouldn't you agree? Harriet stopped. Lady Strathwell looked at her, complete composure, not hostile, not triumphant, simply clear, the expression of a woman who knows exactly what she knows and has decided to go on knowing it, publicly, without qualification, for as long as it is useful. Harriet understood in that moment, with the instinctive precision that had always been her greatest asset, that she had lost. The only remaining question was what form the losing would take. She chose the dignified exit. No scene, no confrontation. She cited a headache, collected her things, and left. In the carriage, alone, she made calculations. She was above all things a practical woman. She came to Hugh the next morning. He was in his study at Ashenvale Hall, reading a letter from his solicitor with the expression of a man reading his own sentence. She sat down across from him. She was beautifully dressed, as always. She did not waste resources, not even now. But something had changed in her face. The performance still present, but running on diminished fuel, and for the first time he could see something beneath it. "I'm going to Paris," she said. Hugh looked at her. "There are people there I know. Opportunities that are better suited to my current situation." A pause. Something crossed her face that in different circumstances might have been regret. "I think we both understand this has run its natural course," he said. "You're leaving." "I'm being sensible," she said. "Which is more than either of us has been if we're honest." And because she was who she was, even at the end, she could not quite resist. "You ought to have managed your affairs better, Hugh. I cannot work with a man whose creditors are louder than his promises." Hugh looked at her for a long moment. He thought of Cecilia, sitting across the small dining table with the winter light on her face, asking him in that clear and steady voice why he wanted her back. What would be different? What he actually meant. Treating the answers as though they mattered, as though he were someone worth the effort of a real question. He thought of the contrast. "Goodbye, Harriet," he said. She left. He sat in the study with the solicitor's letter and the silence and the unobstructed view of the past 3 years. He allowed himself to look at it without flinching. It was not comfortable. It took some time. Then he picked up his pen and wrote. The letter arrived at Merrow Park on a Saturday morning. Cecilia was at the desk. She was always at the desk now. Though the nature of the work had shifted from defensive to constructive, the way building changes in character when you stop reinforcing walls and start laying foundations instead. When Mrs. Croft brought the letter on a small tray, she recognized Hugh's handwriting and set aside what she was doing. It was 4 pages long. His handwriting, usually controlled and precise, ran slightly uneven in places, the writing of a man who had been pressing hard on the pen for a long time before committing to paper. He did not make excuses. This surprised her enough that she stopped and read that section twice. He described what he had done, what he had chosen, repeatedly, when choosing differently had been available to him. What he had taken for granted across 9 years in the specific way of a man who had confused reliability for inexhaustibility, who had looked at the life Cecilia had built around them and assumed it was simply the natural order of things rather than the result of constant, invisible, unrewarded effort. He said he was sorry. He said it was not enough. He said he knew it was not enough, and said it anyway because she deserved to hear it, even if it changed nothing. And then, this, which she read 3 times, sitting at her desk with the winter light at the window and the fire going quietly in the grate. I think I have been a poor husband, not because I disliked you, but because I never bothered to understand you. You were simply there. You were always simply there. I did not understand that this required something from me in return. I understand it now. I am sorry I learned it at such cost, and at such cost to you particularly. Cecilia set the letter down. She sat for a long time. She had thought, when this moment came, that she might cry. She had held the possibility of tears at some distance, had prepared for them. What arrived instead was quieter, something like the last breath of a room you are leaving for good. Not slammed shut, not locked, simply closed, gently, completely, on something that was finished. She folded the letter. She put it in the drawer. She did not write back that day. The legal instrument arrived from Mr. Grail the following Monday. His covering note was 2 sentences. The attached represents the formal separation agreement you instructed me to prepare. I await your signature and your instructions regarding its conveyance. It was not a divorce. Divorce in 1887 remained deeply complicated, practically very difficult, socially very costly. Mr. Grail had explained this with characteristic precision, and Cecilia had understood it and had not expected otherwise. What the document achieved was the practical substance of independence, separate maintenance, separate residence, full and formal control of her own finances and property, no requirement of cohabitation, no legal or social obligation to maintain any association with Hugh beyond the minimum their status technically demanded, freedom in every sense that actually mattered. It only required her signature. She sat at the desk and looked at it for a very long time. Outside, she could hear Mr. Vane in the garden. He had come that morning to look at drainage along the eastern beds, which had been producing standing water after the November rains, and had stayed, as he often stayed now, doing useful things, asking nothing in return, simply present in the way that some people are present, as a steadying quality in the atmosphere. She could hear him speaking with the gardener. The sound of it was ordinary and unhurried and entirely unlike anything she had previously understood home to feel like. She picked up the pen. She put it down. She stood, went to the window. "Mr. Vane," she said. He came from behind the far rosebed, looking up. Patient, present. "Come inside," she said. "I need to think out loud. Mrs. Croft has made shortbread." He came inside. She did not sign the document that day, nor the next. What she did instead was think carefully, without hurry, the way she had learned to do everything in the past months. Not from fear or hope, simply from the conviction that a decision of this permanence deserved to be made in full possession of herself, by a woman who understood precisely what she was choosing and why. She was very nearly there. The winter gathering gave her the rest. The invitation came from Lady Pemberton, who occupied a position in county society so precisely central that what happened at her December assembly would be known in every drawing-room by morning. The invitation was addressed to Lady Cecilia Ashenvale, not the Duke and Duchess of Ashenvale. Lady Cecilia alone. Lady Pemberton had very deliberate handwriting and used it accordingly. Cecilia read the card at her desk and looked out at the bare rose garden for a moment. The beds along the south wall would bloom first, Mr. Vane had said, in spring. She was looking forward to seeing it. She wrote her acceptance and told Vane that evening. They had fallen into an arrangement. Dinner at the park 3 times a week, sometimes more, depending on the weather and the particular demands on each of their time. It had the quality, she thought, of something that had always been there, simply waiting to be noticed. Like a path through a garden that turns out to have been in the ground all along beneath the overgrowth. Lady Pemberton's winter assembly, she said. In a fortnight. Vane was quiet for a moment. Are you ready for it? I think so. She considered this properly. I'm not afraid of them. That is new. I was afraid of them for 9 years, of their assessments, of whether I was sufficient, of what they would say. I'm not anymore. I'm not certain exactly when that changed. I can tell you approximately, Vane said. It was somewhere between your second conversation with Mr. Grail and the discovery that the rose beds were salvageable. She laughed, genuinely, without the careful social calibration that had governed her laughter for 9 years. It came from somewhere unguarded. Will you come? She asked. He looked at her with the quiet directness that she had come to understand was simply his nature, not a performance of honesty, but the real thing, consistent all the way through. I'll come, he said, if that's what you'd like. It is what I'd like. But Vane, she wanted to say this carefully. I am not going to that assembly to make a statement, not to make Hugh uneasy, not to demonstrate anything to anyone. I'm going because I want to be there. And I want you there because, she chose the words without rushing, because you make things better, not easier, necessarily, better. There is a difference. He was quiet for a moment. Cecilia, he said, yes, I should like to say something directly. She waited. He was not a man who staged things or arranged scenes. She had understood this early and had found it after 9 years of a man who had always been slightly performing, deeply restful. He simply said what he meant. I would like to court you, he said, properly, with full knowledge of where things stand, and with no expectation of speed or resolution beyond what you are ready for. I am not asking for anything you cannot give. I am asking for the chance to continue being exactly this, a gesture that took in the room, the fire, the evening, the shortbread, but with intention, with honesty about what it is. Cecilia looked at him. Outside, the winter garden was dark and still, the hills just visible against a sky bright with stars. The fire was warm, the house was quiet in its particular way. Not the silence of absence, but of sufficiency, of enough. She thought of Hugh's letter, still in the drawer. I did not understand that this required something from me in return. She thought of what it had cost him to write that, and what it meant, and what it was, despite everything, too late to alter. She thought of the rose beds along the south wall that would bloom first in spring. Yes, she said. On those terms, yes. Something settled in his face. That smile, the full one, arrived and held. Thank you, he said. Thank you for asking properly, she said. It matters how a thing is asked. I don't think people always understand how much. She signed the document the next morning, not with ceremony. She sat down after breakfast, read every page with the attention it deserved, picked up her pen, and signed her name. Cecilia Margaret Merrow, as she had been, as she still was underneath 9 years of being someone else's duchess. She sealed it, sent it to Mr. Grail with a brief note, and then put on her coat and went out to the rose garden. It was a cold morning, clear and sharp, the kind of winter morning that makes the world look newly edged. She walked the south bed slowly, touching the bare canes, learning by feel which were sound and which had been left too long. She found the one Vane had told her to watch, the old climber at the east corner that looked entirely past saving until you examined it properly and found the live wood underneath. She stood in the middle of the garden for a while, doing nothing except being there. Then she went inside and got back to work. Hugh received the formal agreement quietly. He signed his portion without contest. What followed? And she heard this through Nora, who remained her most reliable correspondent in all matters, surprised nearly everyone who knew him. He engaged new solicitors. He began the actual work of addressing the estate's finances through genuine economy rather than further borrowing. He sold a property in Scotland. He reduced his London establishment. He was seen, Nora reported with barely concealed astonishment, at his desk at 8 in the morning, working. "He looks awful," Nora said when she came for her Tuesday visit. "I mean that constructively. He looks like a man who has stopped pretending, which is always alarming to see in someone who has been pretending for a long time, but generally indicates something worth watching." "He'll be all right," Cecilia said. She meant it as honest assessment, not generosity. "And you?" Nora asked, in the tone she used when she was asking the real question. Cecilia thought about it properly. "I have this house," she said, "which smells of beeswax and my mother's roses. I have Mr. Grail, who is the most useful man I have ever known. I have Mrs. Croft, who makes shortbread that I am fairly certain is not natural in origin." She paused. "I have you. And I have Aldrich Vane, who asks real questions and listens to the real answers and knows the difference between a rosebed worth saving and one that is simply past it." Nora looked at her for a long moment. "You're happy," she said. "Not a question." "I am more than happy," Cecilia said. "I am myself. It turns out they are not the same thing at all, and I had confused them for a very long time." The night of the Pemberton Winter Assembly was clear and cold, the sky above Devonshire enormous and particular in the way of winter skies, as though the county had been set, briefly, into something much larger than itself, and was still adjusting to the scale. Cecilia arrived alone. She and Vane had agreed on this, without much discussion, because they both understood it without needing to explain it. She walked into that room herself. On her own ground, in her own right, that should be visible from the start. She wore deep green. She had always worn ivory. It had been her signature, her armor, the color of a woman performing composure. Green was something different, a choice rather than a defense. She stood in the entrance of the Pemberton Assembly Rooms and paused for one breath. The room was full. The same county faces, the same candlelight and careful dress, the same managed performance of a community taking its annual stock of itself. She had stood in rooms like this 100 times. She had never stood in one like this. She walked in. It happened gradually, as these things do, a recognition spreading outward from where she moved, conversations shifting, faces turning, and then something she had not expected. Lady Strathwell, from her seat near the fire, raised her glass as Cecilia passed, deliberate, unhurried, entirely public. Cecilia inclined her head, and then others came to her, steadily, gravitating in the way people do towards something they recognize as real. Mrs. Brentwood, young Mrs. Caulfield, standing with her chin slightly higher than it had been in October. Lady Witchford, who said nothing, but whose expression said a great deal. Cecilia moved through the room and they found her, and she spoke to each of them with full attention, asking the right questions, meaning every word. She did not look for Hugh. He was there. She knew this the way she had always known where he was in any room, a 9-year reflex that would take time to lose. He was near the far wall, with Thornham and Fenwick, looking considerably less polished than he had in October, and considerably more present. She did not avoid him. She did not seek him. She simply moved through the room being herself. At some point in the middle of the evening, she found herself near him, and it was more awkward to reroute than to simply acknowledge it. "Cecilia," he said. "Hugh." She stopped, looked at him properly. He looked back with an expression she had no category for. Too many things in it, none of them simple, none of them performing. He had stopped performing. She could see it. It was, she thought, the most honest he had ever looked. "You look," he began, and then stopped and said something else. "You look like yourself. I expect I do," she said. A pause. Around them the room moved and talked and performed its annual rituals. "I am glad you came," he said. "I am glad they can all see." He stopped again, tried once more. "You deserve this. This room turning toward you. You deserved it all along." Cecilia looked at him for a moment. "Take care of yourself, Hugh," she said, plainly, without subtext or bitterness, the way you say it to someone you once loved and have released and genuinely wish well from the appropriate distance. He nodded. Something settled in him, a weight set down. "Good night, Cecilia. Good night." She moved on. Vane arrived at 9. She saw him from across the room, unhurried as he always was, moving through the county assembly with the quiet ease of a man who knows his own mind and does not require an audience to confirm it. He found her without searching, which she had begun to understand was simply how it was between them. They found each other easily, as though something navigational had arranged itself without either of them planning it. He stopped beside her. "How is it?" "It's fine," she said. "Better than fine." She looked at him. "Would you like to dance?" He offered his hand. She took it. They moved onto the floor, and the music shifted to something slower and more deliberate. And Cecilia Merrow danced in the Pemberton assembly rooms, with a man who had seen her, truly seen her. Before all of this, who had paid attention when no one else had thought to, and who had been honest enough to say so when it mattered. She was not performing, not composing her expression or managing her posture or maintaining anything at all. She was simply there, present in her own body, in her own life, in her own name. From the far wall, Hugh watched. She knew this without looking. She did not need to look. He watched with the expression of a man who has understood something irreversible and has decided, in the particular way that irreversible understanding sometimes produces, to carry it forward honestly rather than be crushed by it, to become, slowly and without audience, the person who would have deserved better than he had been. It was not a glamorous kind of change. It rarely is. But it was real. Lady Pemberton, watching from near the entrance with the satisfaction of a woman who has arranged things well. And she had arranged several things. The invitation worded precisely as it was worded, Lady Strathwell placed where she was placed, raised her champagne glass to no one in particular and thought, that woman was always going to be extraordinary. She had simply needed a room that was finally large enough. The school was a modest thing, which was exactly right. It sat at the edge of the Merrow Park kitchen garden, in a building that had been a storage outbuilding, until Mr. Vane spent 3 weeks of the following spring converting it, quietly and without any instruction beyond Cecilia's initial description of what she wanted, into something with good light and a proper chimney and enough space for 12 girls to sit without crowding. Cecilia taught on Tuesday mornings, history, not the history of kings and battles, which the girls could find in any book they were likely to encounter, but the history of women who had done things, made things, changed things, often without anyone thinking to write it down. She told these stories the way you tell stories when you know they matter, not as improving examples or cautionary lessons, as accounts of real people who had been alive and thinking and finding their way through a world that did not always make it easy. The girls listened with the quality of attention children produce when they understand instinctively that what they are hearing is meant for them. Cecilia loved those mornings. Merrow Park had not changed much, which was the intention. She had resisted the pull toward improvement for its own sake, had recognized it as a remnant of 9 years of Ashenvale Hall, of the constant need to make things more impressive than they were. The park was what it was. That was enough. That was, in fact, considerably more than enough. But the rose garden was extraordinary. The climber at the east corner, the one that had looked past, saving until you examined it properly, had come back in April in such an extravagant rush of pale pink blossom that Cecilia had stood in the middle of it one morning and felt something so complete and uncomplicated that she had not known quite what to name it at the time. She knew now. That was happiness, the real kind, the kind that does not require an audience, the kind that is simply there, like the blossom, like the cold, clear morning, like the particular quality of light over the Devonshire hills at 6 o'clock on a day in spring that makes you believe, however briefly, that the world is essentially good. Nora came for a fortnight in July, as she had come the previous July, and sat in the garden in the long evenings, complaining pleasurably about London, eating an improbable quantity of Mrs. Croft's shortbread. She brought news. She always brought news. Harriet Pike, formerly Blaine, formerly other names that had served their purpose, was in Paris and had, by all accounts, established herself in the orbit of a wealthy industrialist whose wife was, people said, beginning to observe certain patterns. Cecilia listened without satisfaction or judgment, and thought briefly that she hoped the wife had a good solicitor. Everyone deserved a good solicitor. Sir George Caldmore had recovered better than anticipated. He had married a practical woman who managed her own money and had no patience for self-pity, and this combination appeared to suit him. He had also written a well-regarded pamphlet on agricultural improvement. People found their depths when given the space, Cecilia thought. It was one of the more reliable things about them. Hugh was better. This was Nora's exact word, and Cecilia, turning it over, found it was precisely right, not transformed in the sudden dramatic sense that stories sometimes require, simply better, which was harder to achieve than transformation, and more durable. He had sorted the estate's finances through genuine effort. He was working consistently, at hours that suggested actual commitment rather than performance. He had joined a county improvement committee and found it, apparently, unexpectedly interesting. He had written to Cecilia twice in the past year, not to ask for anything, not to revisit what had been, simply to report, as a man might report to someone whose good opinion he was attempting to earn through means other than charm. The East Tenant cottages had been repaired. The drainage scheme Vane had recommended was producing results. He had started, he said, to see the estate properly, not as a backdrop to his life, but as his actual responsibility. Cecilia had written back both times, briefly, warmly, without opening any door she did not intend to walk through. She wished him well. She meant it completely. Vane asked her to marry him on a Wednesday morning in October, standing in the rose garden in the precise spot where she had stood the previous April watching the climber bloom. He asked her the way he did everything, directly, in his own words, without arrangement or staging. He told her he loved her in the specific way that meant he had been paying attention. To the way she thought, to the precision of her arguments, to the particular quality of her laugh, and the way she moved through the garden in the mornings, and the fact that she had once spent 40 minutes in genuinely spirited disagreement with Mr. Grayle over the interpretation of a property clause, and had been, in Vane's assessment, entirely correct. He said, "I know your independence is hard-won, and I would not ask you to set any part of it aside. I'm asking whether you'd like a partner, someone beside you, not in front of you or behind you, someone on your side." Cecilia stood in the October garden and looked at him for a long moment. She thought of herself at 21, walking down an aisle in full belief that she was the luckiest woman in Devonshire. She thought of what luck actually was, whether it was circumstances or something else entirely, something internal, a quality of honesty and attention, and willingness to keep going when going required effort. She thought of the rose beds. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." They were married in December, small and quiet and entirely themselves. In the garden at Merrow Park, with the people who actually mattered, Nora wept and afterwards denied it. Mr. Grayle attended with the expression of a man whose work is complete and who finds the result satisfactory. Mrs. Croft made a cake so good that it was discussed in the village for 3 months. On a Tuesday morning in the late autumn of the following year, Cecilia Marrow Vane sat at her desk in the Park study. and looked out at the rose garden. The beds were bare and patient, ready for what came next. Aldrich was somewhere on the property, doing something useful, as he always was. The school was closed for the morning, but the teacher had left 3 essays on the corner of the desk, written by the oldest girls on the subject of women they admired, and Cecilia was looking forward to reading them with the uncomplicated anticipation of someone who no longer has to manufacture enthusiasm for anything. Mr. Grail had written about a potential new trust arrangement. There was a decision to make. Nora was coming at the weekend. The climber at the east corner had already begun to show the first faint swelling at the tips of its canes. That meant, if you knew to look, that spring was coming eventually, and would be worth waiting for. Cecilia knew to look. She picked up her pen. She thought for a moment about what she would say if someone asked her. One of the girls in the school, years from now, how she had come from there to here, from that ballroom to this garden. From the woman standing 12 feet away from her own husband, holding a glass of champagne she had not touched, to this. She thought she would say, "I did not leave to punish him. I left because I had spent 9 years building a life around someone else's expectations, and had nearly forgotten that I was permitted to have one of my own. I left to find out who I was without the armor, without the performance, without the role. It took time. It took work. It took rosebeds and a good solicitor, and a woman named Mrs. Croft, whose shortbread I am still not entirely convinced is produced by natural means. But I found her, and she was, it turned out, entirely worth finding.